Thanks, incredible turnout. I just want to begin by saying thank you to SAR and YBF Ventures for hosting this event. We are so lucky to have an organisation that supports Web3, that supports distributed tech in the way that YBF Ventures do. So thank you, SAR, for putting this on. Can we just put our hands together for YBF? And it's very appropriate that we're having it here. Very recently, YBF have just launched a Web3 hub. It's one of the first dedicated hubs in the world called YBF Mesh. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that. I hope you've all had some beers and some snacks and had some interesting conversations. I probably should introduce myself at this point. I'm James, and I work for a cryptocurrency fund here in Melbourne called Apollo Capital. And I just wanted to start the evening by asking a couple of questions to the audience. Don't worry, that it isn't going to be a massive amount of audience participation. I personally hate that. I will just ask some hands. So if this applies to you, could you put your hand up? Who here works in a job that's related to or is in the field of distributed technology? Okay, that's probably 20%. Who here has invested or is invested in cryptocurrency? Okay. Who here thinks that the distributed web will be an integral part to the next phase of internet infrastructure? Okay, that's almost a full house, except for my friend Alex Campbell, the classic skeptic. Who here just came here for the pizza? Which I was promised. And I actually mean beer, so that joke fell very flat because there was no pizza. But anyway, let's get into it. I think just quickly, if the question was who's interested in distributed technology, who wants to learn more, every single hand would be up in the room, and I hope this evening is valuable on that point. The structure of this evening will be questions to the panel, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So we'll probably have 6 to 8 questions at the end. If you think of anything, jot it down, and we'll go from there. But I just want to start by the panel introducing themselves. So perhaps we could start with you, Anthony.
Sure. Thanks for that. I guess my answers to those 3 questions will come out over the next hour or so. But so my name's Anthony Stevens, or Ant. I'm a partner and the Chief Digital Officer for KPMG. Many of you will have come across that brand, but in essence, about 200,000 people globally, a business focused on providing advisory and audit services to a large extent. So in the professional services business. So I look after the transformation of our business, in actual fact, to a digital world, and that involves a bunch of different technologies. So that's me.
Thanks, James, and thanks YBF for hosting us here tonight. My name is Henrik, and I'm the CIO and co-founder of Apollo Capital, a cryptocurrency fund, one of the first crypto funds in Australia. We are an actively managed crypto fund. So what we mean by that is we actively manage a diversified portfolio of crypto assets. And actively managed means that today there are 1,500 different crypto assets. So we believe the way to invest in this space is to actively manage a portfolio of these assets. And my background is in traditional finance, so I spent 20 years in as a quant and in institutional equities in Scandinavia, Singapore, and the US. And I think the team combines the experiences of crypto and traditional finance and venture capital. So that's Apollo.
Yes, thanks to YBF. I'm Joni, tax lawyer from Hall & Wilcox, which is a full-service national law firm. I'm based out of Melbourne. I'm also a mentor in the RMIT Blockchain Business Strategy course that's just launched. Personally, I've submitted a submission to the digital economy strategy consultation process, trying to make a case for a tax system administered by blockchain. And in my role day to day, advise on the tax implications of cryptocurrency at the individual and investment fund levels, as well as blockchain and ICO structures.
I'm Simon. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a project called LOKI. We're based out of here, YBF actually, which is, I suspect, why I'm here. But we just completed our pre-sale. We're a privacy coin based on Monero. We're trying to make some changes that will enable a full node incentive scheme that will allow us to do a bunch of things with private messaging and a whole bunch of other stuff in the future. So, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. We are really lucky to have such a well-qualified panel tonight. I think you'll notice that it's deliberately, we've chosen deliberately the panelists to have quite different experience. They look at blockchain but from different angles. So to begin, Henrik, can you tell us what the hell is distributed technology and Web3?
I can try. So I think one way to look at it is to see Web 1.0 was like the rise of the protocol, so the basic layer of the internet, like TCP, IP, HTTP for websites, and SMTP for email, for example. So that was like quite a static web. Web 2.0, I think, was the rise of Twitter, Facebook, Google, and I think the hope was that it would democratize the web. Everyone could start blogging at Blogspot or tweet, for example. But I don't think it's as decentralized as we would like. So today we have like a couple of social networks and then monetize all our data. So it's quite, currently there is an internet with some very big companies. So in that way it's not really decentralized. And I think the hope for Web 3.0 is the decentralization of the internet, and I think blockchain will be key in that transformation. So we can take ownership of our data, we can monetize our data. So I think, yeah, that's...
Yeah, I think thanks Henrik, that's a really good response. Maybe I'll ask Simon, everyone's talking about Web 3, but what's wrong with Web 2? What is Web 2? You've just explained, but it seems like it's stronger than ever. Everyone's using it. All the companies are the biggest in the world.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with Web 2. Web 2 is fine. The current scheme it works. Like, we use it every single day. We've got a little thing in our pocket which we can access it at a moment's notice. And like this Web 3 thing that we're talking about now, I think it's very forward thinking to be talking about it right now, but it is so not at a level of production that we can discuss it at any real length. It's going to be quite a high level discussion, I think.
Yeah, so if that's the case, are there any problems with Web 2 that Web 3 deal with?
Potentially. I mean, it depends on what you mean by Web 3. I mean, some of the bigger problems with Web 2 at the moment is that, well, again, what is Web 2? But, you know, the Googles and Facebook of the world do control a hell of a lot of data, and I think as time goes on, people probably want to take back ownership of some of that data. But how exactly they do that, and whether or not the trade-offs are going to be worth it, I think is still very unclear. So, I don't know. There's lots. I think the internet has been exploited to the fullest extent, and I think potentially blockchains and cryptocurrencies may open up new avenues for, you know, business development and you know, user growth in various other aspects. But I'm actually more of a skeptic on this sort of, is crypto, is distributed technologies really going to change the way we do things in our daily lives? Just very simply, the way I like to think of it is Web 2.0, whatever you want to call it, addresses the key issue of communication, which is a core function of everything we do. Whereas the things that these distributed technologies are being used for, I think a key example being cryptocurrencies, we don't really do financial transactions as often as we communicate. So I think the impact that it will have in our lives will be relatively small compared to what the internet did.
Does the rest of the panel agree with Simon's mild skepticism?
I mean, I think Web 2.0 was vastly better than Web 1.0. Like Twitter is a factor better than a static New York Times website. But you know, we just learned today that Facebook leaked data on 2 billion users. So there is definitely a big hope for the decentralized web. But I agree with Simon, it will be hard to get there. I mean, there is tremendous networks effect around something like Facebook, so it won't be easy to disrupt these powerful big companies.
Yeah, please.
I'd just say that cryptocurrency is the first wave of blockchain, and where I see one of the big values of blockchain is being information flows. So we're yet to see all of those blockchain use cases come out, but along the supply chain, just managing that information flow reliably, I think will be a value of Web3.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize how early we are in this. I'm interested, Anthony recently co-authored a book with, the co-author is actually in the audience as well, called Chasing Digital, which, as I understand, is a playbook on how businesses can become digitally future-proofed. I'm interested in your perspective. Are we thinking about this the wrong way? Should we think about it in Web 2, Web 3? Or is there a better way of thinking about the future of digitalization?
Yeah, I think there's some real challenges in the market, in society at the moment, that I think organisations, and I'm largely in the corporate space, organisations are recognising as things that they need to think about as they evolve their business and their related strategy over the next few years. And the three that come to mind relate to this concept of public trust. And I think there's been a bit of discussion, like a few folk have talked about this idea of centralisation and all the data's being held by a very small number of companies. And that creates challenges because people, us as individuals, think about what does that mean? Are we really trusting these organisations or not? So that's the first theme. The second theme relates to security and privacy, and I guess it's kind of related. As companies get bigger and more in control, then issues related to security and privacy start to emerge. And the third that I'm really interested in, and I think certainly is represented by the movement around blockchain and cryptos, is this idea of economic models and incentivisation. So the combination of those three things are major sort of like macro themes that I think businesses are starting to think about and work out how they play in that context. And then what does data mean, and what is their strategy got to be as it evolves? So that's sort of
I think it's a really good high-level summary. I think you wrote an article about that.
Certainly did.
Yeah, I read that article.
Good on you.
Okay, so we're getting a bit of a hit of skepticism, which I think is really healthy. There's a lot of hype in this area for sure. So let's keep going down that line for a bit. If distributed technology, Web3 is so good, why, and perhaps Henrik or Joni or anyone can jump in on this one, why does Bitcoin have less transactional throughput? Why is it got quite terrible efficiency if you look at the mining process compared to more centralized solutions like PayPal or Visa?
Well, one way to look at it is like decentralization and blockchain comes with a cost. So it's more costly to do something in a blockchain. It's less efficient than to do it on a centralized web service. So decentralization comes with trade-offs. That's one way. If you don't need decentralization, why use blockchain? I think Bitcoin and blockchain is a revolution because you can, for the first time, take ownership of a digital asset, and more things in this world become digital, and you can, for the first time, own your own money, and maybe your private data, your medical records, and so on. But it comes with trade-offs.
I'd just say, yes, there's an energy cost to the mining network and the process, but there's also a cost for the banking institutions to have all of their people travelling in and out to work every day, and that institution running it itself. So it has to be a question of relativity when we mention how much does it actually cost and consume in energy. And then it's like we see with Uber and Arcade City wanting to decentralise basically the Uber model. What do we really appreciate about centralisation? Well, Uber is able to vet the drivers, so we trust them more, and if we make a complaint, that can be easily dealt with by an authority. Whereas in Arcade City, with a decentralised model, it's not clear how they're going to deal with those sorts of issues.
Yeah, that's a really good example of where decentralisation may fall down. Let's talk about the positives for a moment before we move on to some regulatory questions. What are some key verticals where you guys see most potential in distributed tech, or in blockchain particularly?
Can I start?
Yeah, please.
I love the intersection of digital ID, the current open banking data review, and blockchain. And a startup that can do that intersection well, I think, will be a market leader. But good luck getting through the digital identity framework that's just been released. As a lawyer, I love the concept of smart contracts, but there's two things that trouble me, and that's the code is law. So if I invest in something that is invested by a smart contract, do I live and die by that sword? So if the code is faulty or gets hacked and I lose all of my money, is that it? Or should there be standards around that the code should be put into plain English and then a legal contract or standards set out? And the other thing being incomplete smart contracts. It costs a lot of money to code in variables and fuel it with gas. At what point do you stop and have triggers to advisors and to regulators to give advice and arbitrate in a timely way?
Yeah, that's some good points. Does anyone have any thoughts on some key verticals where we see most potential?
Well, I think the obvious one is money, of course. I agree with Joni, but ID, identity is a big one. Maybe medical data, like the data you want to have private. Disagree with you a little bit about smart contracts. Like what blockchain enables is to take ownership, and that comes with a responsibility as well. So I think we have to take ownership and take responsibility for what we do, and I think that's part of blockchains and smart contract, and code is law, but we still have the national laws that we need to follow. So,
which we'll get into pretty shortly. Do you have any thoughts on that, Anne?
Sorry, go on.
No, please. We're going to move to another section. So
okay.
This is your last chance.
I was just going to say, look, I think in the enterprise, like I guess permissioned and private blockchain space, there's going to be a ton of use cases that start to emerge as organisations think about their exchange of data between themselves and the value-added services that get added on by advisors or third parties doing something to data, and then something else happens to data, and something else happens to data. I think that world is going to open up a bunch of stuff. People tend to focus on, think about the public blockchain or crypto space, but I think there's enormous potential in the enterprise or private or permission space as well.
Yeah, we're going to have a whole section on enterprise blockchain, so
Right.
I'll definitely dig deeper on that one.
True.
Let's move on to regulation. I know that a lot of us who've invested in cryptocurrencies are watching closely the regulatory outlook, especially in tax, and I think Joni could speak to that. But Joni, would you mind just walking us through where Australia is in terms of cryptocurrency regulation at the moment, and just maybe give some examples of some recent developments?
Sure, I can try. I'd say that Australia is kind of at the middle ground. We're not being super proactive and we're not lagging, but we haven't figured out whether we want to be a hub for cryptocurrencies and ICOs, or even blockchain projects yet. To compare, Monaco has just legislated to introduce a blockchain authority, which will oversee a 3-year project where they learn and develop regulations and provisions to foster blockchain projects that are in the national interest, so that will make them more competitive. Gibraltar and Monaco are also very active and open for business. China has banned ICOs. So from a banking and financial services perspective, we take the position that if the coin you're offering is something that is like Bitcoin, something that is true digital cash, then it's not a security or another financial product. Therefore, all you need to do is a white paper. You don't need to prepare a product disclosure statement or a prospectus like a public company or an investment fund ordinarily would, which can be very expensive to do. You just need a white paper, and you should probably talk more about this, but...
Well, I was actually wanting to get Simon's input. You started a blockchain, a cryptocurrency in Australia. Can you tell us about how that process was?
Well, I wouldn't have done it the way we did, because we incorporated in Australia first, which was a silly decision. I think there is...
Why is that?
Well, very simply, there isn't really rules on it yet. I mean, it's very unclear to even our lawyers what exactly we are and where we sit, because there is no clear definition on this. Like, we may still be viewed as a security by ASIC for whatever reason.
What do you think you are?
Well, I clearly don't think I am, otherwise I'd be, probably talking to my lawyer right now, not. Yeah. But yeah, otherwise you'd have to go through the whole rigmarole of doing a prospectus and disclosing a whole bunch of stuff and getting, the requirements are strict, whereas the requirements for doing an ICO are unclear, which is a very interesting distinction. But there are a lot of small countries, and you could call them tax havens if you like, who are making a business out of putting up a regulatory environment that allows people to do this in a defined way. And that's very attractive. So, the BVI, Estonia, Singapore, there's a whole bunch of them out there that have actually created very clear guidelines on how this works. And for the most part, they're like,
so if you were advising government, would you advise that Australia does the same thing?
Well, they can do the same thing, and that'd be great. But I don't think it really matters at the end of the day, because now that this space has been operating for a while, and generally speaking, crypto projects and blockchain projects in general are global businesses. They are by default anyway. If you are looking at this and you're a smart person, you have a decent lawyer, they'll probably point out which jurisdictions are the best ones to target. So you'll probably try and domicile in a given jurisdiction. So I think if the Australian government doesn't want to lose out on an opportunity to do business development here in Australia and support Australian projects and encourage teams to form and grow here in Australia, which you can make an argument that that's valuable, then they may want to make the regulations more clear. But I think just with the resources that the Australian government had and the incentive scheme present, I think it'll be more of like, oh shit, this has happened, we now need to backdate rules, and it'll end up being something probably quite undesirable. And I don't think there's anything we can do about that.
Can I add?
Yeah, please do.
A response?
Yeah, sure.
I think you're very well intentioned, and that's not true of all of the ICO projects that were happening, especially in the lead up to Christmas last year.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to ask you, Joni, are there any consumer provisions available? I mean, there are so many scams out there. Are consumers safe with current Australian regulation?
Well, ASIC's point of view is buyer beware. There are too many of these things out there now for them to issue warnings on every single coin. So if you're investing, be willing to lose your money or know a lot about what you're investing in to be prepared. But to just take one step back, what we were seeing and other advisors were seeing post China's ICO ban and with the cryptocurrency prices rising, a lot of founders and existing businesses were saying, can we ICO? Without actually understanding what a blockchain is and what cryptocurrency is.
Was it kind of like the dot-com boom when dot-com increased the value of companies to a ridiculous amount?
I wasn't advising them, but being told that it was very reflective of that.
Right, okay. I do want to, before we move on from regulation, I really want to get a good picture on how ICOs are going to be regulated. A quote from the US Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Jay Clayton said that I believe every ICO I've seen is a security. Do you think this is true? And I'm interested in how you think Australia is going to approach that problem. Is it going to be more the American way? Is it going to go down Switzerland's clear categorization?
I think where that statement might be coming from is that a lot of white papers really emphasise that the coin will go up in value and that the ecosystem is the next best thing, and they promise wealth and a return, or at least capital growth. If we get into more utility tokens, that you can stake it or do all these things and get a return of cryptocurrency. So I tend to agree with that statement because from a US perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, Henrik, but where there is an expectation of profit, it looks like a security. Australia doesn't have that same simple test, I would call it, and I'm not sure that Australia is going to take the lead in legislating a definition of cryptocurrency and security token, utility token. If anything, what we've seen in the lead up to Christmas is that having any sort of definition means that founders want to get out of it so that they don't have to comply with a prospectus level of disclosure.
Right.
Yeah.
Henrik, I'm interested in hearing about what you said this morning at work, actually. There is a nuanced way of classifying ICOs, maybe even changing the categorization as time goes on. Is that right?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but there was a news about Ripple this morning.
Yeah.
But I think, firstly, I think the SEC quote is really interesting because, so the SEC chairman, I think, made that quote in front of the Senate a few weeks ago, that all ICOs are securities. But I think the interesting thing is that in 9 months ago, SEC put out a statement saying that Ethereum is not a security, it's a virtual currency. So Ethereum was an ICO, and it's not a security according to SEC. So how can all ICOs be securities? That doesn't really square.
Is it a case of if you're a hammer, you only see nails?
Well, the SEC said themselves that Ethereum is not a security. So I think and the second point I think is that it might not matter where you domicile. Like the DAO was domiciled in Switzerland, and SEC basically had the power to go after them for security fraud. Even if you sell a token that is a security in the secondary market to a US citizen, you can be liable. So I think that's really interesting. With the Ripple news last night, what basically we learned is that they tried to pay a couple of exchanges to get listed, and that very much sounds like there is a common enterprise behind that company, for-profit enterprise. And I think the Howey test in the US, which is used to determine what is a security, I think one of the key paragraphs in the Howey test is if it's an investment in a common enterprise, and if you have a for-profit organization behind a crypto, like for example Ripple, that might point towards that being a common enterprise, and if it's a common enterprise, it's most likely it's a security.
Right, so short Ripple.
I didn't say that.
Okay, do you have any comments on security regulation? Okay, well, we can move on to the next section, which is all about kind of how blockchain technology and distributed tech will fit into the enterprise level, and also like some key questions about investing in this stuff. So, Anthony, will the decentralized web, will blockchain technology change the way that KPMG does business?
I think at some level the answer to that is yes, at some level no, and let me explain that. I guess, start with no. KPMG, like a lot of services firms, has sort of two inherent ingredients in which it trades. One is trust that it has with its clients. The second is the relationship it has with its clients. And the relationship is a human thing, right? It's based on the fact that as humans we're social animals and we connect and we seek to understand one another. And firms like, or partnerships like KPMG, we focus very heavily on maintaining those relationships and developing them. So if you look forward, are those sort of two ingredients likely to change? Probably not, and I don't think anyone would argue too strongly against that. I think what is changing though, and it's happening across all services industries to some extent or another, is the nature of the advice that's provided. And I guess in my role at KPMG, I'm focused very much on saying there are some things that are really well served for humans to provide to our clients. In other words, humans apply their skills and intellectual property to provide some advice to clients. But there's other stuff that's better served through the use of technology. And when we start thinking about technology, we then get into the world of saying a lot of what technology is there to do is to manipulate or develop data in different ways. And when we start thinking about data, we then say, are there benefits in using technology like blockchain to create frameworks that extend trust and immutability and all those sorts of concepts between KPMG as a supplier of services and our clients who are typically the owners of that data. So I see a world that will evolve to incorporate blockchain into the nature of the services that we provide, but inherently as a professional services firm, it is sort of deep rooted in the idea that there are humans and professionals providing service.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary on how it'll fit into KPMG. It seems like it's a long way off, even if it does.
Yeah, look, it's a really complex space because KPMG is also an audit firm, and in that context, there's lots of obligations that we have at a regulatory level and at an industry level to conduct business in a particular way and maintain the interest associated with audit obligations. So blockchain is particularly complex in that world, which is a long story.
Sure. Henrik, do you have a comment?
I don't have one.
Oh, right, okay, sorry. I thought you were keen to contribute. I want to go to investment now. Can I ask, maybe anyone can jump in on this one, maybe especially you, given that you've just created a privacy coin, but why should anyone invest in cryptocurrencies? Is it a good hedge against financial markets?
Why would anyone invest in anything? I mean, you invest in something because you expect it to go up. I think there's a difference between why would you use it and why would you invest in it. Why would you use it? In its current form, there are only two real use cases, or three if you include investment as one of them, like especially with a lot of the ERC20 tokens. But the two real use cases that have been proven to be useful so far, one is censorship-resistant transactions. This is primarily what Bitcoin was created to do and what it pretty much only does. It's the only thing it's really useful for. So censorship-resistant transaction is, yes, it's slow, yes, it's very expensive, but no one can actually stop you from doing it, which is the attractive thing about it. There's no bank or middleman that can stop you, or government or anything else. The second use case, and this is relevant to what my guys are trying to do as well, is privacy. Privacy is something that allows us to go beyond cash as the only real means of private transactions. And that's very useful for a whole range of different use cases between, a lot of people bring up nefarious activities as one of the key use cases of privacy, but there are actually lots of instances in which people want transactions to be private. I mean,
could you go through a couple of those examples?
Well, like I'll go from, we've done our raise and most of our raises come in Ethereum, and it's like basically public information, where all the money came from, and you can trace back identities of people there if you know enough information about those particular addresses. And I don't know that it's particularly good for us that the entire transaction history of our entire raise is out there forever. that's the case with blockchain technology at the moment, that most transactions are just traceable through all the time. There's actually a government contract out that's been filled by a major blockchain company by the US government now to do basically tax evasion analysis on people that have used Bitcoin through time, because it is fully traceable.
So can you give some examples of somebody who isn't doing nefarious activities, but who still want to use?
I'm sure you've
blockchain
at
technology?
KPMG have seen transactions every single day that lots of different businesses don't particularly want to be public information or have records of throughout all the time.
No doubt.
Not nefarious ones,
No.
not tax evasion ones. It's just like, if I'm sending.
Confidentiality is important.
Extremely important, and it's extremely important not just across transactions, but across the transfer of information. I mean, all of this Web 1 and Web 2 stuff that we depend on so rigorously is basically dependent on RSA encryption. Without that, we don't have passwords, we don't have secure file storage, we don't have anything that we actually find the internet useful for. So privacy is actually a key concept in the current web, and it will continue to be in the future as well.
Can I just add, legal professional privilege, like we send a lot of things over email and clients don't realise that sometimes if they just forward it, then they're waiving privilege in certain circumstances. So that's an information flow, but if there was an infrastructure to allow something that was private to be kept private, that would be one non-.
And am I right in saying that LOKI actually includes some form of messaging as well?
That's right. So we're actually creating a peer-to-peer messaging system on top of our existing infrastructure, and that'll allow for people to do end-to-end encrypted messaging using perfect forward secrecy on top of the transaction network as well. So there's a huge scope there for people to be able to use our particular system. And in the future, we'll be doing things like file storage and other sorts of things as well that we're thinking of. There's a whole bunch of use cases that are all related to privacy that are critical for a whole bunch of businesses, governments, individuals all over the planet.
Yeah. Henrik, yeah, please.
Yeah, I completely agree with Simon. Like, privacy is key to your financial history, and it's also the law, right? If you're a financial institutions, you cannot publish your transactions, so they have to be private. And Bitcoin is all open, so privacy is key. And we don't have freedom of speech without privacy. So yeah, we definitely need that. Then we invest in privacy coins as a fund. But I think you forgot one important use case,
Sure.
Crypto kitties.
Yeah. That's why you should invest in crypto, everyone. It's crypto kitties.
Because crypto kitties. Yeah, if you haven't heard about that, please, you should look it up. It's a pretty funny story. So I just want to kind of speak specifically about investment, and I have a question for LOKI.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain how the privacy space is getting very busy? There are Zcash, Monero, Dash, Cloakcoin, Zencash.
Most of the ones you listed are rubbish.
Okay, so why is yours better?
We are not better than Monero because we basically are Monero. We're doing things on top of Monero. Now,
You're
why
a
is
fork from Monero.
We
is
are
that
a
right?
fork from Monero. So the question then is, why is Monero good? And what are the two sort of main competitors for the privacy kings of crypto? So there's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement right now about something called a ZK snark, which is a interesting new piece of cryptography that has come out in the last few years, which allows people to succinctly prove that they have done something without actually showing exactly what it is. And there's a coin came out 2 years ago called Zcash, which has become reveled as the top privacy coin. The trouble is with it is there's a lot of problems with it right now. ZK snark is very computationally expensive. They're also opt-in, so a lot of people use it without realizing that they're not actually doing it privately. And some people just have it to invest in it, whatever else, and there's a whole range of problems with that. If privacy is your core thing, there are some
And
new.
none of them have messaging capability, is that right?
Well, Zencash, which is a fork of Zcash, claim to have messaging capability, but they've literally just taken the text field of on-chain transactions and called that messaging, which is an absolute joke. But anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
And then there's Monero, in fact, which is more relevant to us, which uses 3 different cryptographic schemes to shroud every aspect of every transaction, and you can opt in to show people what you've done if you want. But the important thing is it's private by default. So that creates a whole history of transactions that you can mix in with and makes it a lot more private. And in my opinion, Monero is by far the more superior privacy implementation today, which is why we fought for them. And then we do a bunch of stuff to improve on the things that Monero's done and add additional functionality on top.
Right. No, it's interesting to get some background, and it's good to have an Australian privacy coin out there as well. We're jumping around a little bit, but I do want to hit on the enterprise level stuff a little bit more. Could you talk about how organizations would need to change internally in order to even contemplate bringing in these very radically new technologies that we're talking about? Is it not so much the technology, but is it the business itself that needs to change?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this, as it happens, the book that you mentioned earlier that we've written, which has been published in about July, so it's not out just yet. We did a lot of thinking about what is it that organisations are going to get right before thinking about technology in the context of them sort of moving their business models or adapting a different approach in today's economy. And I think it sort of boils down to, broadly speaking, 3 areas. One is the actual strategy the organisation needs to incorporate some of the themes that we've seen in businesses like Amazon and Google and Microsoft and these kind of guys over the last decade or so. So there's lots to think about there, and network effects and different incentive models to get users engaged and stuff like that. Second key area that I think is really important to consider is what we refer to in the book as being organisational design. And in a simple sense, you know, most pre-digital incumbents, existing businesses have got huge amounts of momentum in the way that they operate today. And my experience has been that in order to kind of embrace technology and think about business in a different way, you kind of need to think about having 2 engines, engine A and engine B. So think about incubating or initiating a different approach, but somewhat separate to the way that you do business ordinarily. The third, which is kind of related, is culture. And its culture is a really, for those who've worked in large organisations, particularly powerful force. You know, it creates a huge amount of momentum in the way that things get done, and particularly the way in which decisions get made. And for those, there's probably plenty in the room tonight that are in the sort of startup space, and everyone I think appreciates in that world that the way decisions are made is particularly unique in a startup context as distinct from a corporate context. Quite simply, decision gets made a lot quicker, they're more agile, there's a safe to fail mentality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those 3 areas are sort of precursors that businesses need to think about before they can start entering into this world of saying, let's get some technology and let's do stuff with it. And you see a lot of that happening, and it just doesn't work terribly well because of those aforementioned points aren't sorted out.
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider those. I think the book's title is Chasing Digital, and I think a lot of people are chasing blockchain right now. They're thinking about how they can incorporate it in their business. So it's interesting to hear those internal factors that might be preconditions to adopting the technology.
And you see, sorry, just to add, you see companies all the time saying, you know, it's a bit like 98, 99, 2000 companies saying, let's get a website up, let's sell stuff online. And inevitably, you know, most of that stuff didn't work. It's a bit like blockchain. Large companies think about, let's adopt the blockchain, let's get guys focused on that and installing it. But ultimately, if there's no strategic grounding for it, or the business isn't set up to do something meaningful with it, it's not going to work right.
So a lot of major enterprises are making their own private blockchains. I know JP Morgan have developed Quorum. IBM have developed their own private blockchain. Henrik, can you give me your opinion on private blockchains and whether you think they're what their place is?
I'm probably a bit more skeptical to private blockchains and enterprise blockchains than Henrik and Anthony here. I mean, I think decentralization is what blockchain brings, and it's about disintermediating the middleman. So if you're the middleman, it's hard, I think, to implement blockchain technology. It's more about, I think, sharing information between trusted organizations, and you can probably reach efficiencies doing that. But I think it's less revolutionary maybe than the open options that we invest in.
So yeah, I'm interested in touching on that. So private blockchains kind of go against the ethos of what you believe blockchains are, which is decentralization and whatever else. Can you explain to me the place that funds have in people investing in this technology? If you were a skeptic, you could think that that is a middleman in people investing into decentralized tech. I'm interested in the reasons why someone would choose a fund over, say, an index fund where you could buy a token in Crypto 20, for example.
So one goal with the fund is to make it really, really easy to get exposure to crypto assets. So investing in a fund like our fund is like buying an Australian equities fund. There are, I think, big barriers to entry still in crypto, like custody. How do you handle private keys? These are still unsolved big problems. Tax is another one that is very messy. So I think there is a need for funds, for listed instruments that make it very easy for investors to get exposure, and that's what we want to bring with the fund. I think it's still too early to index this space. It's like super immature still, it's very inefficient. So that's not something I would do myself.
Okay, so I just want to finish the kind of panel discussion with a broad question. Is distributed tech, is blockchain specifically a force for good? And I'll just say quickly that in 2014 and beforehand, there was a lot of talk about helping the unbanked through this technology. Now I'm hearing about scam ICOs. Has it changed, or is there still an ethos for this to be a force for good? And I'd like an opinion from each panel member, or from anyone who wants to chip in.
I think it's a force for whatever people decide it's going to be. I mean, there's been all this talk about it, being used for what do they call it, universal basic income, or identifying people and all this stuff. But the reality is, like, this distributed technology is putting the capability to do the most neoliberal things imaginable in the hands of people, anarchists and all sorts of people that really don't care about the greater social good. So I think this technology is probably enabling a whole bunch of things to happen that people aren't really aware that it is. And I think a lot of it is also really dependent on the user base. So I think it's all high and mighty to say, well, this is all going to decentralize the world and that's going to bring us X, Y, Z benefits. But at the end of the day, like the economic models behind this don't really point in that direction, I think. And the whole thing with banking the unbanked, I think, is quite a flawed concept, given that the barriers to entry in order to use the cryptocurrency are out the hands of most impoverished people. Having a decent computer to run the software required to use this stuff.
All those kind of
and just like, how do you store your private keys when you barely have a watertight house? It's like you have bigger problems to solve than a bank account at that point, and I think that's not really that useful to those sort of people. And I think a lot of the sort of ideological fervor that's gone on in the last few years has been pretty misguided. And I think this could become something really good, could be something really bad, but probably land somewhere pretty benign, I think.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other comments on whether it will be a force for good?
I don't think anyone knows the full potential of blockchain yet. We're still trying to figure that out. And what I see it as is being a technology to connect ecosystems which haven't been able to be connected before. Where there's transaction costs along that ecosystem, there is the opportunity for those to be removed and process to be made more efficient, which if I look at that from a government administration perspective, that means less taxpayer dollars spent administering the system and more going towards the causes that we actually need to put money towards. So that's my belief in the technology. Whether we'll get there is a different question.
Right.
Yeah, I think we had a similar debate at the beginning of the internet. Was the internet a force for good or not? I think today we can all agree it was a force for good, and I think that should be our basic assumption with new technology. And like we wouldn't have a project like LOKI unless we had the ICO hype last year. And I think for like Bitcoin, it's very easy to be here in Australia or in North America or Europe, and our government and our central banks pretty much work quite well, but most of the people live in a world where they have capital controls or super high inflation, or where the government can seize your assets without due process. I mean, that happens even in places like the US. So I do think it's a force for the good.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I'm pretty big on diversity in the sense that I think everyone on this planet has got a different point of view and a different space in which they want to operate and live their lives. And if that's the case, then ultimately those that buy into this stuff, and as the use cases develop, people want to participate. There's plenty of people in the world that are going to make those things incredibly valuable. For those that elect or feel that it doesn't make a lot of sense, there'll be communities that will come together that sort of, I suppose, distance themselves from whatever it is, and there's going to be good guys and bad guys. So I don't know. I'm reasonably philosophical about what's going to happen. I tend to agree with Simon. I think it's pretty well. It'll end up just sort of washing out, meaning some things to some people, but not others.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those comments, and thank you for the panel for answering those questions. Now we'll move to Q&A now. Does anyone want to kick us off with a question to the panelists? Yeah, just out the back there. We'll do if you could speak up, or if you could speak up. And
okay. Yeah, question for Simon, primarily on privacy coins. I mean, right now, if you look at the market cap of privacy versus non-privacy coins, and privacy are a fraction. Take Zcash, or whatever else. Are we going to move to a world where they're kind of in parallel? And there's uses for a public blockchain, but for all the reasons, like you said, you're funding, you don't want everyone knowing where your money came from. So is that going to reach parity, or what does that look like 5 years from now, privacy?
You're asking me to predict prices, and I'm just not in the business of doing that, unfortunately. I think there is a lot of, I think there's a user base for privacy coins and private networks in general that would use it if they knew more about it. I'll say that much.
All right, Henrik, can you answer that? Because you're in the business of prices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think so. In 5 years, we might have privacy in things like Bitcoin. So these are evolving protocols, right? So something like Bitcoin can see what's happening in Zcash and Monero and adopt what works. So maybe there will be privacy in 5 years. Who knows?
Great. Is there another question? Yeah, up the front. Yeah.
Quick question for Joni about the rush towards SAFT docs and then the rush away from SAFT docs, and then a lot of people moved to the SAFT model and just felt they were protected, and now suddenly there seems to be panic about the protections offered in that sort of structure.
Great question. Can you explain what SAFT docs is?
It's a mechanism. It modified from people who use it in the traditional startup world, where it's a simple agreement for equity. In this case, it's a simple agreement for tokens. And they've effectively said, get in early, you've got to give them a token. And I think in the US, they've come back now and said, well, hold on. The only reason they got in was to generate a gain. And a lot of advisors have pushed people towards the SAFT model. And now there's a significant amount of panic around that advice and the ability to protect yourself if everyone comes from it.
I can't answer this, but Simon
Simon, can you comment on
So
the
the lawyers that
SAFT?
actually created the SAFT actually said, like, straight up this, the SAFT itself is a security. It is an offering of a security. So I think people rushed to the SAFT because it seemed like an obvious, it seemed like someone had finally created a framework to do these ICOs from. without really understanding the implications. So I think the advice that we got was basically you can use a SAF, just don't do it to Americans and a bunch of other countries, which is kind of an interesting piece of advice because it came out of America. So I think the more general answer to your question is there isn't a clear framework, and people are obviously trying to find it. So I don't know that there has actually been an exodus away from the SAF. I mean, it is a decent document for a bunch of reasons, but yeah.
Great.
Henrik.
I think so. Like ICOs was supposed to be this democratizing of investing, and like now we're seeing private rounds for accredited investors and no crowd sale at all. So it's like in 6 months we went from this fundraising where everyone could participate on equal terms, where now we have small seed rounds where some big institutional investors can invest at a fraction of the price for the private pre-sale, and then there is no crowd sale at all. I think the other interesting thing is that, like in the US, I think with the securities law there, before the network actually has launched, it's considered a security. So your tokens might be locked in until the network is launched, until there is a utility, and then it can be considered a utility token instead of a security.
Yeah, thanks. Any more questions before we wrap up? I'll just go in the middle here.
This is to Anthony. We're reading some recent news about KPMG's partnership with Blue Seal. They originally did a sort of decentralized database system, and I was wondering how it is possible for a centralized company like KPMG to partner with a decentralized token for a database system and then work together towards a product. Because obviously if you are doing these sorts of partnerships, that the product Blue Seal seems to be in essence trying to generate profit, and if KPMG is going towards trying to apply KYC protocols for enterprises in that space, I was wondering how this collaboration can exist in like a decentralized world.
I'm not familiar with what was, I just missed. It was just hard to.
Blue Seal.
Sorry.
Blue Zell's the name of the project.
Blue Zell. So I'm not just right up front. I'm not familiar with that. There's lots of stuff going on around the world, so I'm not familiar with that particular arrangement. I think I said earlier, this is a space for a lot of services firms where their role and participation in these sorts of projects is being reviewed and thought through pretty carefully for all the reasons that you're touching on. So I don't really have a lot more to add outside of that. Sorry.
Do we have probably have time for 2 more questions? Yeah, straight at the back.
So it's generally considered that coins like Bitcoin aren't securities, but if we implement a model like proof of stake, how does that kind of play into the legal framework? Because in that situation, you're holding coins, and for those coins, you're getting a dividend or a return back. So how does that kind of affect things?
And sometimes you even get voting rights with that stake as well.
As in with Decred, I think, as well. That's a coin that's actually partnered with YBF Ventures. Anyway, you can answer that.
Well, I think there's a legal Corporations Act answer, but there's also a tax answer as well. And where you are getting something or you're entitled to dividends, then from a tax perspective, the underlying investment would still be treated as your capital, and then what you're getting as a return, in general terms, would be assessable like your normal income. For Corporations Act, I can't answer that question, but if you have got voting, rights to the assets on winding up and the features of what we call a share, then if it looks and smells like one, then maybe you're in. Do you have a comment?
I have a question for you, Joni.
Yeah.
Would it depend if it's passive income or if it actually have to vote on something, which blocks are valid or which transactions are valid? If you have to perform something to receive something, is that still security?
The idea is that if you're doing proof of work, you're actually doing something for that. Whereas if you're doing proof of stake, you're just validating blocks, right? So
But
what
something goes wrong, then your coins at stake are lost. So it's more that you lose part of your investment. So it wouldn't actually be a return to you, it would be a loss. But if you're carrying on a business, then from a tax perspective, we would try and say, is that deductible to you in the ordinary course of your business, in a proof of stake type concept. So in that case, if you have voting rights and things that look like an ownership stake, and that is lost, then that might be a capital loss rather than a revenue loss. Sorry to get.
I think it's pretty clear that lawyers will be employed and smart contracts will not replace them. We have time for one more question before we wrap up. Just over there.
Hi, how do you reckon operational costs within the blockchain space will be cut down moving forward? Would that be when Web 3.0 becomes a bit more acceptable as a new standard, maybe?
So operational costs being cut down.
It's more expensive now.
What do you mean by operational costs? Like what sort of costs are we talking about?
Transaction costs and the likes of it, it's more expensive to operate within the blockchain space at the moment as it is in the real world, if I can call it that way, right? So would the cost get cut down later on? And
So
how
let's
would that be?
let's deal with the premise first. Is it more expensive to operate in the blockchain world? Let's start with that, and then answer the second question.
Yes, it is always going to be more expensive. There is no question. So I don't really buy the premise of the question, but yes, it will become cheaper in the sense that there is more infrastructure being created always, and there's scaling issues being addressed and whatever else right now. Whether or not you see value in those scaling solutions is another question, but there's a whole, it's a constantly evolving space, and like I said before, none of this stuff is really production ready. So I think there's, as far as applications for this stuff, there's very few examples of it. And so to compare costs between different systems right now is sort of a funny question.
I just have a general comment, and people that know technology way better than I can explain this to all of us. But I think that's why there are alternatives to proof of work, because that is the very expensive process to go through. We're now seeing proof of stake, proof of time, 6 other different ones. To tackle that problem of cost and energy involved in verifying transactions. But I also think that that's what IOTA was trying to solve by, and I'm not going to explain this well, but leapfrogging from the previous 2 transactions.
IOTA is widely discredited, but I think your point is a really important one. Proof of work is not the only solution for consensus. There are many others.
It's not a bad one though. I mean, it's been proven to be pretty
and
secure.
I actually just really wanted to get Simon's opinion on this. So proof of work is very expensive, and as you rightly point out, there are proof of stake is a cheaper model. I know Chia is doing a thing called proof of space.
Cheaper in an energy sense, or
cheaper in an energy sense?
It doesn't necessarily mean that your transaction fees are going to be any cheaper. It doesn't mean that as a business it's going to be any cheaper to use any particular coin. I think consensus mechanisms are a completely separate discussion, and it gets super hairy super quick.
I think that's probably out of the bounds of this evening. I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks guys for being such a great audience. We're going to have a lot more events like this at YBF. This is a very high-level event talking about general trends in distributed tech. But there will be much more events coming up that are more specific, more related to all these kind of little problem areas we touched upon today. I'm going to pass over to Sar now, but I just want to quickly thank our wonderful panel members for giving up their Thursday night to share their experience and knowledge. So if we could just put our hands together for